Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. But before we dive into the wine-soaked chaos, let me tell you why this story matters. The Bacchanalia weren't just wild parties. They represent one of the most dramatic clashes between religious freedom and state power in ancient history. They reveal the deep tensions between traditional Roman values and the intoxicating influences of Greek culture. Most importantly, they show us how quickly fear and political ambition can transform religious practices into weapons of mass destruction. Over the next few episodes, we're going to explore every twisted detail of this saga. We'll meet Pacula Annia, the priestess who transformed innocent religious rites into something far more sinister. We'll witness the dramatic moment when young Publius Ebutius nearly became a victim of these ceremonies. We'll watch as Consul Spurius Postumius Albinus launched one of the most brutal crackdowns in Roman history, and we'll discover how thousands of Romans died in the aftermath, their only crime being association with these forbidden rituals. Tonight, we start at the beginning, in the sacred groves outside Rome, where the god Bacchus was worshipped in ways that would soon spiral completely out of control. The story begins not with scandal, but with devotion. Bacchus, known to the Greeks as Dionysus, was the god of wine, fertility, and religious ecstasy. His worship had ancient roots, stretching back to the earliest days of Greek civilization. For centuries, women had gathered in his honor to perform sacred rites, drinking wine, dancing through the night, and experiencing what they believed was divine possession. These were deeply spiritual ceremonies, conducted by respectable matrons who saw their participation as a sacred duty. When these rituals first arrived in Rome during the 3rd century BCE, they maintained their traditional character. Small groups of women would gather on just 3 days each year, always during daylight hours, always under the careful supervision of established priestesses. They would drink wine, yes, but moderately. They would dance and sing hymns to Bacchus, celebrating the god's power over nature and fertility. Most importantly, they would maintain the strict boundaries that separated the sacred from the everyday world. But Rome, in the 2nd century BCE, was a city in transformation. Wealth was pouring in from conquered territories across the Mediterranean. Greek slaves, many of them highly educated, were bringing new ideas about philosophy, art, and religion. Roman aristocrats were developing tastes for luxury that would have horrified their ancestors. Traditional Roman values, built on discipline, duty, and respect for authority, were beginning to crack under the pressure of prosperity and foreign influence. Into this changing world stepped a woman whose name would become synonymous with corruption and scandal. Pacula Annia. She wasn't born into the role of high priestess of Bacchus. She wasn't even particularly wealthy or well connected by Roman standards. But Pacula possessed something far more dangerous than money or noble blood. She had vision, charisma, and an absolute willingness to break every sacred tradition that had governed Bacchanalian worship for centuries. Pacula's rise to power within the Bacchanalian cult remains shrouded in mystery. What we know comes primarily from the accounts of Roman historians writing decades after the events, men who had their own reasons for portraying her in the darkest possible light. But even allowing for their bias, the picture that emerges is of a woman who systematically transformed innocent religious ceremonies into something far more dangerous. Her first innovation was deceptively simple. Instead of gathering during the day, Pacula moved the ceremonies to nighttime. She argued that Bacchus was a god of mysteries, that his true power could only be experienced under cover of darkness. The change seemed minor, but it had profound consequences. Daylight ceremonies were public by nature. Neighbours could see who was coming and going. Husbands knew when their wives were participating in religious rites. Darkness provided cover, secrecy, and the intoxicating sense that normal rules no longer applied. Next, Pacula increased the frequency of the gatherings. Instead of 3 days per year, she instituted monthly ceremonies, then weekly. Finally, she established a schedule where bacchanalian rites occurred 3 times every week. What had been a rare and sacred observance became a regular feature of Roman life, at least for those wealthy enough to participate. But Pacula's most radical innovation was also her most destructive. She opened the ceremonies to men. For the first time in the history of bacchanalian worship, males were invited to participate in rites that had been exclusively feminine for over 1,000 years. She justified this change by claiming that Bacchus had appeared to her in a vision, commanding her to initiate her own sons into the mysteries. From there, it was a small step to welcoming other men, particularly young men from prominent families. The inclusion of men transformed everything about the ceremonies. What had been spiritual gatherings of matrons became wild parties where wine flowed without limit, where social boundaries dissolved, and where the normal constraints of Roman society simply ceased to exist. Young aristocrats found themselves in an environment where anything was permissible, where excess was not just tolerated, but encouraged, where the only rule was that there were no rules. Marcus Plautius was one of the first young men to be initiated under Pacula's new system. Born into a senatorial family, he was everything a young Roman aristocrat should be: handsome, well-educated, and destined for a career in politics. His mother, eager to ensure his success, saw his initiation into the bacchanalian mysteries as a form of divine protection, a way to secure the favour of the gods for her son's future. Marcus approached his first ceremony with the reverence appropriate to a sacred ritual. He bathed, fasted, and dressed in the white toga reserved for religious occasions. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, he made his way to the sacred grove where the ceremonies were held, accompanied by other initiates and veteran participants. The grove itself was carefully chosen for its isolation and natural beauty. Ancient oak trees formed a natural amphitheatre around a clearing where altars to Bacchus had been erected. Torches provided flickering light that cast dancing shadows among the trees. The air was thick with the smoke of burning incense and the intoxicating aroma of wine from dozens of amphorae that had been opened for the occasion. At first, everything seemed appropriately solemn. Pacula herself, now an imposing woman in her 50s, led the gathering in traditional hymns to Bacchus. Wine was distributed in ceremonial cups, and the participants drank while offering prayers for the god's blessing. Marcus felt the warm glow of religious devotion, the sense that he was participating in something ancient and meaningful. But as the night progressed, the ceremony began to change. The hymns became louder, more frenzied. The dancing grew wilder. More wine appeared, stronger wine, mixed with herbs that heightened its intoxicating effects. Marcus found himself swept up in the collective ecstasy, his normal restraint dissolving along with his ability to think clearly about what was happening around him. By midnight, the ceremony had transformed into something that bore little resemblance to traditional religious worship. Participants were stripping off their clothing, claiming that Bacchus demanded they approach him in the same state of nature in which they had been born. Men and women were pairing off, disappearing into the darker recesses of the grove. Others were engaging in acts that would have been scandalous in any other context, but which seemed perfectly natural in the heightened atmosphere of the ceremony. Marcus later described that first night as simultaneously the most liberating and most terrifying experience of his young life. Liberating because he felt freed from every constraint that had governed his behavior since childhood. Terrifying because he began to understand that he was participating in something that went far beyond religious worship, something that could destroy his reputation, his family's honor, and his future political career if it ever became public knowledge. But Marcus kept returning. They all did. The ceremonies had become addictive, not just because of the wine and the sexual freedom, but because they offered an escape from the increasingly rigid expectations of Roman society. For a few hours each week, young aristocrats could forget about their duties to family, state, and tradition. They could indulge every desire, explore every forbidden pleasure, and experience a form of personal freedom that was otherwise impossible in their highly structured world. Pacula encouraged this dependence. She understood that the more her initiates transgressed traditional boundaries, the more committed they became to the secrecy of the group. She also understood that knowledge of their participation gave her tremendous power over some of the most influential young men in Rome. Sons of senators, future magistrates, potential generals, all of them were now bound to her by shared guilt and mutual vulnerability. As the ceremonies grew more elaborate and more transgressive, Pacula began to introduce new elements that pushed the boundaries even further. She claimed that certain initiates had been chosen by Bacchus for special honors, rituals that required even greater secrecy and even more dramatic violations of traditional Roman values. These inner ceremonies, she explained, were the true mysteries of Bacchus, accessible only to those who had proven their absolute dedication to the god. The inner circle that Pacula created around these special mysteries became known among the participants as the Sacred Brotherhood, though nothing about their activities bore any resemblance to traditional Roman concepts of brotherhood or sanctity. These were the ceremonies where the real business of the Bacchanalia took place, where religious worship became a thin disguise for activities that would have shocked even the most worldly Romans. Lucius Opimius was among the first to be selected for these inner mysteries. The son of a former consul, Lucius possessed exactly the combination of political connections and moral flexibility that Pacula valued most highly. His initiation into the Sacred Brotherhood took place on a moonless night in late summer, when the darkness was so complete that participants could barely see each other across the sacred grove. The ceremony began like the others, with wine and hymns, and the gradual building of religious ecstasy. But as midnight approached, Pacula made a signal that caused most of the participants to withdraw to the edges of the grove. Only a select group of perhaps 20 individuals remained in the central clearing, men and women who had already proven their willingness to abandon every trace of traditional Roman morality. What happened next would haunt Lucius for the rest of his life. Pacula announced that Bacchus demanded a special sacrifice, not of animals or wine, but of human innocence. She produced a young slave, barely 16 years old, who had been drugged with wine mixed with powerful herbs that left him conscious but unable to resist. The assembled members of the Sacred Brotherhood were told that they must participate in rituals that would bind them forever to Bacchus and to each other. The details of what followed are almost too disturbing to recount, even at this distance of over 2,000 years. Suffice it to say that the young slave did not survive the night, and that every member of the Sacred Brotherhood became complicit in acts that went far beyond religious transgression into the realm of criminal conspiracy and murder. But Lucius discovered that this was not an isolated incident. The Sacred Brotherhood had been conducting these extreme rituals for months, each one more elaborate and more horrifying than the last. Pacula had created a system where participants were gradually introduced to increasingly transgressive activities, each step making it more difficult for them to withdraw without facing exposure for their previous actions. The genius of Pacula's system was that it created perfect blackmail material against some of the most powerful young men in Rome. Once someone had participated in the inner mysteries, they could never risk having their activities exposed. They became trapped in an escalating spiral of transgression and complicity, unable to escape without destroying themselves and their families. Gaius Volumnius learned this lesson the hard way. the youngest son of a prominent plebeian family. Gaius had initially been attracted to the Bacchanalia by rumors of wild parties and sexual freedom. Like many young Romans of his generation, he was eager to rebel against the strict moral codes of his elders and embrace the more permissive attitudes that were becoming fashionable among the aristocracy. His first few ceremonies were everything he had hoped for and more. The wine was the finest he had ever tasted, imported from the best vineyards in Greece and mixed with exotic spices that heightened its intoxicating effects. The women were beautiful and willing, freed from the constraints that normally governed interactions between the sexes in Roman society. The atmosphere was charged with an erotic energy that made every sensation more intense, every pleasure more acute. But as Gaius became more deeply involved in the Bacchanalia, he began to notice disturbing undercurrents beneath the surface hedonism. Conversations would stop abruptly when certain people approached. Participants would disappear for hours during ceremonies, returning with expressions that mixed satisfaction with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Most troubling of all, some of the younger initiates who had been enthusiastic participants simply stopped attending ceremonies altogether. And when Gaius encountered them in other social settings, they refused to meet his eyes. When Gaius finally worked up the courage to ask questions about these disappearances, he was told that some initiates had been selected for special honors, deeper mysteries that required them to withdraw from the regular ceremonies. But the people who told him this had a way of looking at him that made it clear he should not pursue the subject further. The truth came to light when Gaius accidentally stumbled upon one of the inner ceremonies while searching for a friend who had vanished during a regular Bacchanalia gathering. Hidden behind a screen of bushes at the edge of the sacred grove, he witnessed acts of violence and depravity that shattered his understanding of what the ceremonies were really about. He watched in horror as members of the sacred brotherhood tortured and killed a young man whose only crime had been threatening to expose the true nature of the Bacchanalia to the authorities. He saw respected matrons participating in rituals that defiled every principle of Roman religion and morality. Most shocking of all, he recognized several prominent young men whose families he knew personally, men who would one day hold high office in the Roman state, participating enthusiastically in activities that would have resulted in immediate exile or execution if they had been discovered by the authorities. Gaius tried to leave quietly, but his movement caught the attention of one of the guards that Pacala had posted around the perimeter of the grove. Within minutes, he found himself dragged before the assembled members of the sacred brotherhood, forced to kneel in the dirt while Pacala decided his fate. The high priestess explained his options with terrifying clarity. He could join the sacred brotherhood voluntarily, participating fully in their activities and binding himself to them through shared guilt and mutual vulnerability. Or he could refuse, in which case he would join the growing number of former initiates who had disappeared permanently from Roman society. But Pacala offered a third option that revealed the true sophistication of her operation. Gaius could become one of her agents within Roman society, using his family connections and social position to identify potential new recruits and to gather intelligence about any official interest in the Bacchanalia. In exchange, he would be allowed to attend regular ceremonies without being forced to participate in the inner mysteries, and his family would be protected from any retaliation. Gaius chose the third option, a decision that transformed him from a pleasure-seeking young aristocrat into an active participant in what was essentially a criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated the highest levels of Roman society. Over the following months, he recruited dozens of new initiates, carefully selecting young men and women who possessed either valuable political connections or personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The recruitment process that Gaius learned to execute was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Potential initiates were first approached at social gatherings where wine and conversation flowed freely. They would be engaged in discussions about the restrictive nature of traditional Roman morality, about the liberating influence of Greek philosophy, about the need for young Romans to embrace more sophisticated attitudes toward pleasure and personal freedom. Those who showed interest were invited to smaller, more intimate gatherings, where the conversation became more explicit and the wine stronger. They would meet other young aristocrats who spoke glowingly about their participation in certain exclusive religious ceremonies that offered unprecedented opportunities for personal expression and spiritual growth. The actual invitation to attend a bacchanalia ceremony came only after weeks or months of careful cultivation. By the time someone received an invitation, they had already been psychologically prepared to view their participation as a natural progression from the conversations and relationships they had been developing. They saw themselves as joining an elite group of enlightened individuals who had moved beyond the narrow constraints of traditional Roman society. What they didn't realize was that they were stepping into a carefully constructed trap designed to compromise them completely and bind them permanently to Paculla's organization. The initial ceremonies seemed relatively innocent, little more than wine parties with religious themes. But each subsequent gathering pushed boundaries a little further, introduced elements that were a little more transgressive, created situations that were a little more difficult to explain to outsiders. By the time new initiates understood what they had really joined, they were already so compromised that withdrawal was impossible without risking complete social and political destruction. They had been photographed, so to speak, in compromising positions with compromising people engaging in compromising activities. Even if they had wanted to expose the bacchanalia, doing so would have required them to confess their own participation in activities that violated every principle of Roman law and morality. This system of gradual compromise and mutual vulnerability created an organization that was simultaneously incredibly powerful and incredibly fragile. Powerful because it included hundreds of members from the most influential families in Rome, people who controlled vast wealth, held important political positions, and commanded significant military resources. Fragile because the entire structure depended on maintaining absolute secrecy about activities that would have outraged ordinary Romans and provoked immediate and devastating official response if they ever became public knowledge. Paculla understood both the power and the fragility of what she had created. She used the power ruthlessly, leveraging her knowledge of her initiate's activities to influence political decisions, business transactions, and social relationships throughout Roman society. But she also took elaborate precautions to protect the secrecy that was essential to the organization's survival. The ceremonies were held at multiple locations throughout the city and surrounding countryside, each site carefully chosen for its isolation and symbolic significance. The primary location remained the sacred grove outside Rome's walls. But Paculla had also established meeting places in private villas, abandoned temples, and even in the underground chambers beneath certain aristocratic homes. This network of locations served multiple purposes. It made the ceremonies harder for authorities to track. It allowed for simultaneous gatherings that could accommodate the growing membership, and it created the impression that the influence of Bacchus was spreading throughout the entire region. Each location was prepared with meticulous attention to detail. Altars were erected and consecrated according to ancient Greek rituals that Paculla claimed to have learned from sacred texts smuggled out of mystery schools in Athens. Elaborate decorations transformed ordinary spaces into otherworldly environments where normal social conventions seemed irrelevant. The walls were draped with rich fabrics in deep purples and gold, colours associated with Bacchus and divine royalty. Expensive incense burned continuously, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously intoxicating and sacred. But the most important element of each location was its isolation from the normal rhythms of Roman life. Participants could arrive as ordinary citizens and senators, but once they crossed the threshold into sacred space, they entered a realm where different rules applied. The physical separation from the outside world made it easier to justify behaviours that would have been unthinkable in any other context. Titus Sempronius discovered this psychological transformation during his first visit to one of the villa locations. A serious young man who had recently returned from military service in Spain Titus had been recruited by his cousin Marcus, who assured him that the ceremonies offered valuable networking opportunities with other young aristocrats. Titus approached his first bacchanalia with the same disciplined mindset that had served him well in the army, expecting a relatively formal religious observance, followed by some social drinking and political conversation. The villa where the ceremony took place belonged to a wealthy widow named Claudia Tertia, whose husband had died in the recent wars and left her with vast estates, but no male relatives to manage them. Claudia had joined the bacchanalia partly for spiritual reasons, but mainly because Pacula promised that the ceremonies would provide her with powerful male allies who could protect her interests in the complex world of Roman business and politics. When Titus arrived at the villa, he was struck by how completely it had been transformed. The normally austere Roman architecture had been softened with flowing draperies and exotic decorations. Servants dressed in Greek fashion offered wine in cups that were works of art in themselves, crafted from precious metals and decorated with scenes from the myths of Bacchus. Music drifted through the air, not the martial songs that Titus was accustomed to, but haunting melodies played on instruments that seemed designed to induce a dreamlike state. The other participants were equally transformed. Men and women whom Titus recognized from the forum and from social gatherings in the city appeared completely different in this context. Their formal togas had been replaced with flowing robes that seemed to move with lives of their own. Their usual expressions of dignified reserve had been replaced with looks of anticipation and barely contained excitement. Most disturbing of all, the normal social hierarchies that governed every aspect of Roman life seemed to have completely dissolved. Titus watched in fascination as a former consul knelt before a young woman barely out of her teens, accepting wine from her hands as if she were a goddess dispensing divine favor. He saw senators who normally competed ruthlessly for political advantage, embracing each other with genuine affection, their rivalry forgotten in the sacred atmosphere of the ceremony. Most shocking of all, he observed married women flirting openly with men who were not their husbands, behavior that would have resulted in immediate divorce and social disgrace in any other setting. The ceremony itself began with traditional elements that would have been familiar to any Roman who had participated in religious observances. Pacula, magnificent in robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light, led the assembled participants in prayers to Bacchus. She poured wine offerings on the altar and burned incense while reciting ancient formulas in Greek that most of the participants could not understand, but that sounded appropriately mysterious and sacred. But as the evening progressed, the familiar elements gradually gave way to innovations that Titus found increasingly disturbing. The prayers became more emotional, more personal, with participants encouraged to confess their deepest desires and fears to the god. The wine offerings became wine consumption, with larger and larger quantities being distributed among the celebrants. Most unsettling of all, the formal structure of the ceremony began to break down as individual participants claimed to be receiving direct communications from Bacchus. These supposed divine communications always seemed to involve instructions for the recipients to engage in behaviors that violated fundamental Roman values. A respectable matron would suddenly announce that Bacchus was commanding her to remove her clothing and dance naked around the altar. A young senator would claim that the god was ordering him to confess his secret political ambitions and seek the blessing of the assembled company for his planned betrayal of his political allies. A married woman would declare that Bacchus himself was demanding that she demonstrate her devotion by coupling with a stranger in full view of the other participants. Titus realized that these supposed divine revelations followed a pattern that was clearly being orchestrated by Pacula and her inner circle. The messages always pushed participants to reveal compromising information about themselves or to engage in compromising behaviors that could be used against them later. The religious framework provided justification for actions that would otherwise be recognized as blackmail, extortion, or simple criminal coercion. The genius of the system was that it made victims complicit in their own victimization. When someone followed what they believed was a divine command to engage in compromising behavior, they could not later claim that they had been coerced, without also admitting that they had been foolish enough to believe that a god was speaking directly to them. The religious context provided perfect cover for a criminal enterprise that was systematically compromising some of the most powerful people in Rome. As Titus watched the ceremony spiral into chaos, he began to understand that he was witnessing something far more dangerous than a religious revival or even a breakdown of traditional moral standards. He was seeing the systematic destruction of the social bonds that held Roman society together, carried out under the cover of religious devotion by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The evening reached its climax when Pacula announced that Bacchus had chosen several participants for special honors that required them to withdraw to a private chamber for additional ceremonies. Titus was not among those selected, but he noticed that the chosen individuals included several people whom he knew to be involved in important political and business negotiations. He also noticed that they departed with expressions that mixed excitement with what looked uncomfortably like fear. Those who remained in the main chamber continued their celebration, but Titus found himself unable to enjoy the festivities. The wine tasted bitter in his mouth, the music seemed discordant, and the laughter of the other participants had an edge of hysteria that made him deeply uncomfortable. When he finally left the villa in the early hours of the morning, he felt as if he had witnessed the beginning of something that could destroy everything he had been raised to value about Roman civilization. But Titus also found himself unable to stay away from subsequent ceremonies. Like so many others, he had been psychologically hooked by the combination of transgression and community that the Bacchanalia provided. The ceremonies offered him access to a level of Roman society that would otherwise have been closed to someone of his relatively modest background. They also provided him with information about political and business developments that gave him significant advantages in his own career. Most importantly, they satisfied a hunger for meaning and transcendence that traditional Roman religion had never been able to address. The formal state ceremonies that Titus had grown up with were impressive spectacles designed to demonstrate Roman power and maintain social order, but they offered little in the way of personal spiritual experience. The Bacchanalia, for all their corruption and danger, provided participants with intense emotional and spiritual experiences that made ordinary life seem pale and meaningless by comparison. This spiritual dimension of the Bacchanalia was perhaps their most seductive and most dangerous aspect. Participants genuinely believed that they were experiencing direct contact with the divine, that their transgressive behaviors were not sins but sacraments, that their violations of traditional Roman values were actually expressions of a higher morality revealed by Bacchus himself. The religious framework didn't just provide cover for criminal activities, it transformed those activities into sacred duties that participants felt honored to perform. Quintus Marcius experienced this transformation more completely than most. A young man from a family of modest means, who had achieved some success as a military tribune, Quintus was initially attracted to the Bacchanalia by the prospect of networking with wealthy and influential Romans who could advance his career. He attended his first ceremony with purely practical motivations, hoping to make connections that would help him secure a profitable posting or an advantageous marriage. But Quintus discovered that the spiritual dimensions of the ceremonies spoke to needs he hadn't even realized he possessed. The son of a stern father who had emphasized duty and discipline above all else, Quintus had spent his entire life suppressing desires and impulses that seemed incompatible with Roman virtue. The Bacchanalia offered him permission not just to acknowledge those suppressed aspects of his personality, but to celebrate them as expressions of divine will. Under the influence of wine and the charged atmosphere of the ceremonies, Quintus experienced what felt like genuine religious ecstasy. He felt the presence of Bacchus as a living force that filled him with power and purpose. He spoke in tongues, prophesied future events, and performed acts of apparent healing that amazed other participants and convinced him that he had been chosen by the god for special purposes. These experiences were so intense and so meaningful to Quintus that he became one of Paculla's most devoted followers. He recruited aggressively among his military contacts, bringing dozens of young officers into the organization. He donated substantial portions of his military earnings to fund the ceremonies. Most significantly, he volunteered to participate in the inner mysteries, eager to demonstrate the depth of his commitment to Bacchus and to experience even more profound spiritual revelations. The inner mysteries that Quintus joined were held in the deepest chambers beneath Claudia Tertia's villa, spaces that had been excavated and decorated specifically for the most secret aspects of Bacchanalian worship. These chambers were reached through a maze of tunnels that disoriented visitors and made it impossible for them to determine exactly where they were in relation to the world above ground. The psychological effect was to create the impression that participants had literally descended into the underworld, that they were operating in a realm where the normal rules of human society no longer applied. The ceremonies conducted in these underground chambers pushed transgression to its absolute limits. Participants engaged in acts that violated every taboo of Roman civilization, often involving violence, sexual depravity, and ritual murder that was justified as sacrifice to Bacchus. The victims were usually slaves or foreigners who could disappear without attracting official attention, but occasionally the inner mysteries claimed Roman citizens who had threatened to expose the organization or who had simply become inconvenient to its operations. Quintus participated enthusiastically in these extreme ceremonies, convinced that his actions were not crimes but sacred duties commanded by Bacchus himself. The religious framework was so complete and so psychologically compelling that participants lost the ability to evaluate their behaviors according to normal moral standards. They lived in a closed system where every action was evaluated solely according to its contribution to the worship of Bacchus and the advancement of the organization that claimed to serve him. This complete moral inversion was perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Paculla's system. She had created an environment where intelligent, educated Romans could commit acts that would normally horrify them, while maintaining their self-image as virtuous people serving a higher purpose. The psychological mechanisms that made this possible were sophisticated and effective, drawing on deep human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence, while systematically destroying the moral frameworks that might have provided resistance to criminal manipulation. The organization that emerged from these psychological innovations was unlike anything that had previously existed in Roman society. It combined the spiritual authority of religious institutions with the practical power of political networks and the ruthless efficiency of criminal enterprises. Members were bound together by shared guilt, mutual vulnerability, and genuine religious conviction, creating loyalty that was both voluntary and coercive. This unique combination of elements made the Bacchanalia incredibly effective at achieving their goals, whatever those goals might have been. They could influence political decisions through their members in the Senate, manipulate business transactions through their connections in the commercial community, and eliminate obstacles through their willingness to use violence when necessary. They had created a shadow government that operated parallel to the official Roman state, pursuing objectives that served the interests of the organization rather than the broader Roman community. But the very success of the organization also created the conditions for its eventual destruction. The more powerful the Bacchanalia became, the more visible their influence became to Romans who were not part of the organization. The more completely they dominated certain aspects of Roman life, the more obvious it became that something was fundamentally wrong with the normal operations of Roman society. The first serious challenges to the organization came not from official investigations, but from family members who began to notice disturbing changes in their relatives who had joined the Bacchanalia. Parents observed that their adult children had become secretive and evasive about their activities. Spouses noticed that their partners had developed new interests and friendships that they refused to discuss. Business associates found that deals and negotiations that should have been straightforward had become mysteriously complicated by the involvement of third parties who seemed to wield influence that was completely disproportionate to their official positions. These individual observations might have remained isolated concerns, if not for the efforts of one young Roman whose personal experience with the Bacchanalia would eventually bring down the entire organization. His name was Publius Ebutius, and his story would become the catalyst for one of the most dramatic confrontations between religious freedom and state authority in the history of the Roman Republic. Publius Ebutius came from the kind of Roman family that embodied traditional values while struggling with the realities of a changing world. His father had died when Publius was still a child, leaving behind a modest estate and a reputation for honesty that was more valuable than gold, but less useful for paying debts. His mother, Duronia, had done her best to raise him according to strict Roman principles, but as Publius approached his 20th birthday, she faced a problem that was becoming increasingly common among Roman families of moderate means. The young man needed connections. In the old days, a reputation for virtue and basic competence might have been enough to secure a decent career in public service or the military. But the Rome of 186 BCE rewarded networking over merit, influence over integrity. Without powerful allies, even the most capable young Romans found themselves shut out of the opportunities that could secure their futures and honor their family names. Duronia's solution seemed perfectly reasonable when she first proposed it. She had remarried several years earlier to a man named Titus Sempronius Rutilius, a freedman who had accumulated considerable wealth through careful investments and shrewd business dealings. Rutilius moved in circles that included some of the most influential Romans of the day, and he had assured Duronia that he could provide Publius with the introductions and recommendations that would launch a successful career. What Duronia didn't realize was that Rutilius had his own reasons for wanting to cultivate a relationship with her son. The freedman had been initiated into the Bacchanalia several months earlier, recruited by business associates who had convinced him that participation in the ceremonies would provide him with access to social circles that would otherwise remain closed to someone of his background. Rutilius had found the experience intoxicating, not just because of the wine and the sexual freedom, but because it offered him a form of acceptance among aristocratic Romans that his wealth alone could never purchase. But Rutilius had also discovered that advancement within the organization required him to demonstrate his value by recruiting new members, particularly young Romans from respectable families who possessed the kind of social credentials that could enhance the organization's influence. Publius represented exactly the kind of recruit that would impress Pacula and her inner circle. Young enough to be molded, well-connected enough to be valuable, and financially vulnerable enough to be motivated by the prospect of advancement. The conversation that changed Publius's life took place on a warm evening in late spring, as the three of them shared dinner in the garden of Rutilius's villa. The older man had been drinking more heavily than usual, and his tongue had been loosened by both wine and excitement about a ceremony he had attended the previous night. He began describing the Bacchanalia in terms that made them sound like the answer to every problem that a young Roman might face. The ceremonies, Rutilius explained, brought together the most dynamic and forward-thinking Romans of the day, people who understood that the old ways of doing things were no longer adequate for the challenges of governing a Mediterranean empire. They offered opportunities for networking that were simply unavailable through traditional channels. They provided access to business deals, political alliances, and social connections that could transform an ordinary career into something extraordinary. Most importantly, Rutilius continued, the ceremonies offered spiritual experiences that went far beyond anything available through conventional Roman religion. Participants didn't just observe rituals, they became active participants in divine revelations. They experienced direct communication with Bacchus, receiving guidance and inspiration that could illuminate every aspect of their lives. They discovered aspects of themselves that conventional morality forced them to suppress, learning to embrace the full spectrum of human experience as expressions of divine will. Publius listened to this description with growing interest and growing unease. The opportunities that Rutilius described were exactly what he needed to secure his future and honor his family's legacy. But something about the way his stepfather spoke about the ceremonies troubled him. There was an intensity in Rutilius's eyes that seemed to go beyond religious devotion into something that looked uncomfortably like obsession. There was also a careful vagueness in his descriptions that suggested he was concealing as much as he was revealing. Duronia, however, was completely convinced by her husband's arguments. She had been worried about Publius's prospects for months, watching other young men from similar backgrounds secure advantageous marriages and profitable appointments, while her son remained on the margins of Roman society. The idea that religious devotion could provide practical benefits appealed to her own sense of traditional values, even if the specific religious practices that Rutilius described sounded somewhat unconventional. The decision was made that evening, though Publius himself had little voice in the process. Duronia announced that she wanted her son to be initiated into the Bacchanalian mysteries, and Rutilius agreed to make the necessary arrangements. Publius found himself committed to participating in ceremonies that he didn't fully understand, sponsored by a stepfather whose motives he was beginning to question, all in service of career advancement that might come at a price he wasn't prepared to pay. The preparations for Publius's initiation began immediately. Rutilius explained that candidates needed to undergo a period of purification before they could participate in the sacred mysteries. For 10 days, Publius would need to maintain strict chastity, avoid contact with anyone who had not been initiated into the mysteries, and follow a special diet that would prepare his body and spirit for the transformative experience ahead. These requirements seemed reasonable enough to Publius, even admirable in their emphasis on self-discipline and spiritual preparation. But as the days passed, he began to notice that the purification process was having effects that went beyond simple physical cleansing. The isolation from his normal social contacts left him feeling disconnected from his usual sources of judgment and perspective. The special diet, which emphasized foods associated with Bacchus and excluded many staples of ordinary Roman cuisine, seemed to heighten his emotional responses while making it difficult for him to think clearly about what he was experiencing. Most disturbing of all, Rutilius had arranged for Publius to spend his days of purification in the company of other recent initiates, young Romans who spoke about the ceremonies with an enthusiasm that bordered on fanaticism. They described experiences that sounded simultaneously wonderful and terrifying, spiritual revelations that had completely transformed their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They also made it clear that anyone who had been chosen for initiation was incredibly fortunate, and that failure to appreciate this honor or reluctance to embrace the full experience would be seen as ingratitude that could have serious consequences. By the time the 10 days of purification were complete, Publius felt as if he had been psychologically prepared for an experience that he still couldn't fully imagine, but that he now understood was far more significant than he had originally realized. The other initiates had created expectations that made it difficult for him to approach the ceremony with anything approaching objectivity. He had been told repeatedly that the experience would be life-changing, that he would emerge from it as a completely different person, that nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The night of his initiation was moonless, which Rutilius explained was essential for ceremonies that revealed the deepest mysteries of Bacchus. They travelled to the sacred grove outside the city walls in a covered cart that prevented Publius from seeing exactly where they were going. The darkness and the secrecy created an atmosphere of anticipation that was simultaneously exciting and deeply unsettling. The grove itself was more elaborate than Publius had expected. Torches had been arranged to create pools of flickering light, separated by areas of complete darkness. Altars decorated with flowers and precious metals had been erected at strategic points throughout the space. The air was thick with incense that produced a sweet, cloying smoke that seemed to cling to clothing and hair. Most impressive of all, the assembled participants numbered in the hundreds, Far more than Publius had imagined could be involved in what he had thought was a relatively small and exclusive organization. Paculla herself was magnificent in robes that seemed to capture and reflect the torchlight, creating the impression that she was surrounded by an aura of divine radiance. She spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the grove, despite the size of the gathering, welcoming the new initiates and explaining the significance of the ceremony they were about to experience. Her words were carefully chosen to create the impression that they were participating in ancient traditions that connected them directly to the gods, while also making it clear that they were joining an organization that would expect absolute loyalty and discretion. The early stages of the ceremony followed patterns that were becoming familiar to Publius from his conversations with other initiates. Wine was distributed in ceremonial cups, prayers were offered to Bacchus, and hymns were sung in Greek that created an appropriately mysterious and sacred atmosphere. Publius found himself swept up in the collective emotion of the gathering, feeling connected to something larger and more meaningful than anything he had experienced in conventional Roman religious observances. But as the night progressed, the ceremony began to evolve in directions that Publius found increasingly disturbing. The prayers became more personal and more emotional, with participants encouraged to confess their deepest desires and fears to the assembled company. The wine distribution became more frequent and more generous, with stronger varieties being introduced as the evening continued. Most unsettling of all, the formal structure of the ceremony began to break down as individual participants claimed to be receiving direct communications from Bacchus. These supposed divine revelations followed patterns that Publius was beginning to recognize as carefully orchestrated rather than genuinely spontaneous. Participants who claimed to be speaking for Bacchus invariably delivered messages that encouraged other attendees to engage in behaviors that violated fundamental Roman values. A young woman would announce that the god was commanding her to demonstrate her devotion through public displays of affection with strangers. A married man would claim that Bacchus was ordering him to confess his political secrets and seek the blessing of the company for his planned betrayals. Publius realized that he was witnessing a systematic process of psychological manipulation disguised as religious experience. The participants, who claimed to be receiving divine messages, were clearly working in coordination with Paculla and her inner circle, delivering carefully scripted instructions designed to compromise other attendees and bind them to the organization through shared guilt and mutual vulnerability. The climax of the evening came when Paculla announced that Bacchus had chosen several of the new initiates for special honors that would complete their transformation into full members of the sacred community. Publius was among those selected, a distinction that the other attendees greeted with expressions of congratulation, mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. The chosen initiates were led away from the main gathering to a smaller clearing deeper in the grove, where additional altars had been prepared for what Paculla described as the most sacred aspects of Bacchanalian worship. The group that accompanied them included some of the most prominent participants from the main ceremony, men and women whom Publius recognized as influential figures in Roman society, but who now seemed transformed by wine and religious fervor into something alien and threatening. The ritual that followed was unlike anything in Publius's experience or imagination. Under the pretext of demonstrating complete surrender to the will of Bacchus, the new initiates were required to participate in acts that violated every principle of Roman morality and personal dignity. They were told that resistance or reluctance would be interpreted as rejection of the god's will, with consequences that were left deliberately vague but clearly ominous. Publius found himself faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could participate willingly in activities that would compromise him completely, but secure his acceptance into an organization that could provide him with wealth, influence, and social position beyond anything his family background would normally allow. Or he could resist, accepting the certain destruction of his reputation and possibly his life, but maintaining his integrity and his connection to the values that had shaped his upbringing. The decision was made easier by the arrival of additional participants who had not been present at the main ceremony. These were members of Pakula's inner circle, individuals whose faces showed the kind of moral corruption that comes from years of systematic transgression. They moved with the confidence of people who had long since abandoned any pretense of traditional morality, and they spoke about the activities that were planned for the new initiates with casual cruelty that revealed the true nature of the organization. Publius understood that he was not witnessing religious devotion, but criminal conspiracy. Not spiritual transformation, but systematic destruction of everything that made Roman civilization worth preserving. The realization gave him the strength to resist the psychological pressure that had been building throughout the evening, to reject the offers and threats that were being made, and to demand that he be allowed to leave immediately. The response to his resistance revealed how completely the organization had abandoned any connection to legitimate religious practice. Instead of respecting his spiritual concerns or attempting to address his doubts through theological discussion, the other participants responded with immediate hostility and barely concealed threats. They made it clear that knowledge of the organization's activities was not something that could be safely possessed by someone who was not fully committed to its purposes. Publius realized that he was in mortal danger, that his refusal to participate in the inner mysteries had marked him as a threat that the organization could not allow to survive. But he also realized that escape from the immediate situation would not solve his fundamental problem. He now possessed knowledge about criminal activities involving some of the most powerful people in Rome. Knowledge that made him permanently dangerous to an organization that had demonstrated its willingness to use violence to protect its secrets. The events of that night transformed Publius from an ordinary young Roman seeking career advancement into a man with information that could bring down an entire network of corruption and conspiracy. But possessing that information also made him a target for an organization that had the resources and the ruthlessness to eliminate threats to its survival. His escape from the grove that night was possible only because of confusion that erupted when one of the other new initiates also attempted to resist participation in the inner mysteries. In the chaos that followed, Publius was able to slip away into the darkness and make his way back to the city, but he knew that his problems were only beginning. The organization now knew that he possessed dangerous knowledge and had demonstrated his unwillingness to be silenced through participation in compromising activities. They also knew his identity, his family connections, and his daily routines. Most importantly, they had members throughout Roman society who could monitor his activities and ensure that any attempt to expose their operations would be detected and prevented. Publius spent the following days in a state of terrified uncertainty, unsure whether he was being watched, unsure whom he could trust, and unsure what options were available to someone who possessed information that powerful people would kill to suppress. His stepfather had become distant and hostile, making it clear that Publius's refusal to complete his initiation had created problems that extended far beyond his immediate family. His mother remained supportive, but increasingly frightened, as she began to understand the true nature of the situation her son faced. The solution to Publius's dilemma came from an unexpected source. His mother had confided her fears to a female relative named Abutia, a woman whose own experiences with the Bacchanalia had given her insight into the organization's methods and vulnerabilities. Abutia had lost a son to the inner mysteries several years earlier, a young man who had disappeared permanently after threatening to expose activities that he could no longer participate in with a clear conscience. Abutia's grief had motivated her to learn everything she could about the organization that had destroyed her family, and her investigations had revealed information that would prove crucial to bringing down the entire network. She had discovered that the Bacchanalia's power depended entirely on their ability to maintain secrecy about their activities, and that official Roman authorities remained completely unaware of the organization's existence and influence. More importantly, Abutia had identified the one Roman official who possessed both the authority and the integrity necessary to take effective action against the organization. Spurius Postumius Albinus was serving as consul for the year, a position that gave him supreme executive authority within the Roman state. But unlike many of his colleagues, Albinus had somehow remained untouched by the corruption that had infiltrated so many aspects of Roman government. Abutia's plan was elegant in its simplicity. If Publius could present his information to Albinus in a way that demonstrated both the scope of the conspiracy and the immediate danger it posed to Roman society, the consul would be obligated to take action regardless of the political consequences. The key was to provide evidence that was so compelling and so detailed that Albinus would have no choice but to launch a full investigation, even if that investigation implicated some of the most powerful people in Rome. The meeting between Publius and Consul Albinus took place in secret, arranged through intermediaries who could ensure that the Bacchanalia's extensive network of informants would not learn about it in advance. Publius presented his testimony with the precision of someone whose life depended on being believed, describing not just what he had witnessed, but providing details about the organization's structure, membership, and methods that could be verified through independent investigation. Albinus listened to this testimony with growing horror and growing determination. As a traditional Roman who believed deeply in the values that had built the Republic, he was outraged by evidence of systematic corruption that had penetrated the highest levels of Roman society. As a practical politician who understood the realities of governing a complex empire, he recognized that the conspiracy Publius described posed an existential threat to the stability of the Roman state. But Albinus also understood that taking action against such a powerful and well-connected organization would require careful planning and absolute commitment. The Bacchanalia had members throughout the government, the military, and the business community. They had resources that could be used to defend themselves or to retaliate against anyone who threatened their interests. Most importantly, they had demonstrated their willingness to use violence against anyone who posed a danger to their operations. The consul's response to Publius's testimony would determine not just the fate of the Bacchanalia, but the future direction of Roman civilization itself. The Republic stood at a crossroads between the traditional values that had guided its rise to power and the corrupting influences of wealth and foreign culture that threatened to destroy everything that made Rome distinctive. The decision that Albinus made in the days following his meeting with Publius would echo through the centuries, shaping the character of Roman society and establishing precedents that would influence the relationship between religious freedom and state authority for generations to come. But that decision and the dramatic events that followed from it would unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated, transforming a single young man's resistance to corruption into one of the most consequential political crises in the history of the Roman Republic. The wheels of Roman justice began to turn with a deliberation that masked the fury building within Consul Spurius Postumius Albinus. For 3 days after his meeting with Publius Abutius, the consul maintained his normal schedule, attending Senate meetings, reviewing military dispatches, and conducting the routine business of governing an empire. But behind his composed exterior, Albinus was orchestrating what would become one of the most comprehensive investigations in Roman history. The consul understood that he faced an opponent unlike any that Rome had previously encountered. This wasn't a foreign enemy that could be defeated through military superiority, nor a political rival that could be outmaneuvered through legislative tactics. The Bacchanalia represented a cancer that had grown within the very organs of Roman government, a conspiracy that had infiltrated the families, friendships, and business relationships that formed the foundation of Roman society. Albinus began his investigation by quietly assembling a team of trusted associates who had somehow remained untouched by the corruption that Publius had described. His first recruit was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a former consul whose rigid adherence to traditional Roman values had earned him a reputation for inflexibility that now proved invaluable. Marcellus brought not only his own integrity, but also a network of contacts throughout the Roman military who shared his commitment to the old ways. The second member of Albinus's inner circle was Lucius Valerius Flaccus, the urban praetor whose responsibilities included maintaining order within the city of Rome itself. Flaccus possessed detailed knowledge of the criminal underworld and the investigative techniques necessary to penetrate organizations that operated in secrecy. More importantly, he commanded a force of lictors and other officials who could be trusted to carry out orders without alerting the targets of their investigations. The third crucial addition to the team was Gaius Servilius Geminus, the Pontifex Maximus, whose authority over Roman religious practices gave him the legal standing to investigate allegations of religious corruption. Geminus had already been disturbed by reports of irregular religious activities, but he had lacked the specific information necessary to take action. Publius's testimony provided him with the evidence he needed to launch a formal inquiry into practices that violated the fundamental principles of Roman religion. Working together, these four men developed an investigative strategy that would allow them to gather evidence about the Bacchanalia without alerting the organization to the danger it faced. They understood that premature action would simply drive the conspiracy deeper underground, making it more difficult to identify all the participants and eliminate the threat completely. They also recognized that many of the people involved in the organization might be victims rather than willing criminals, individuals who had been manipulated or coerced into participation, and who deserved an opportunity to redeem themselves. The investigation began with careful surveillance of the locations where Publius had witnessed bacchanalian activities. Teams of trusted agents, many of them military veterans who had served under Marcellus in various campaigns, were positioned around the sacred grove and the private villas where ceremonies were conducted. These observers were instructed to maintain detailed records of who attended gatherings, how long they stayed, and what behaviors they exhibited upon departure. Within a week, the surveillance teams had identified patterns of activity that confirmed the most disturbing aspects of Publius's testimony. The ceremonies were indeed being held multiple times each week, with attendance that included some of the most prominent citizens in Rome. More significantly, the observers noted that many participants appeared to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol when they departed, while others exhibited signs of psychological distress that suggested traumatic experiences. The breakthrough in the investigation came when one of the surveillance teams witnessed an event that provided independent confirmation of the criminal activities that Publius had described. During a ceremony at Claudia Tertia's villa, the observers saw several participants dragging what appeared to be an unconscious person toward the underground chambers where the inner mysteries were conducted. The victim was a young man whom the agents later identified as Marcus Flavius, the son of a relatively obscure plebeian family who had no obvious connection to the Bacchanalia. Marcus Flavius had been recruited into the organization several weeks earlier by Gaius Volumnius, the military tribune who had become one of Pacula's most effective agents. Flavius possessed no particular wealth or political connections, but he had one characteristic that made him valuable to the organization. He worked as a clerk in the office of the urban quaestor, a position that gave him access to financial records and administrative documents that could be useful for various criminal enterprises. The recruitment of Marcus Flavius followed the same pattern that had been perfected through years of practice. Volumnius had approached him at a tavern popular with young Romans of modest means, engaging him in conversations about the frustrations of working within the rigid hierarchies of Roman government. Over several weeks, these casual encounters had evolved into more serious discussions about opportunities for advancement that might be available to someone willing to embrace more flexible approaches to traditional Roman values. The actual invitation to attend a Bacchanalia ceremony had been presented as an opportunity to network with influential Romans who could provide Marcus with better employment opportunities. Volumnius had emphasized the religious aspects of the gatherings, describing them as authentic spiritual experiences that connected participants with divine forces that could guide their careers and personal lives. He had also mentioned the social benefits of joining an organization that included some of the most dynamic and forward-thinking members of Roman society. Marcus had accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, seeing it as exactly the kind of opportunity he needed to escape from the drudgery of clerical work and achieve something more significant with his life. His first ceremony had been everything Volumnius had promised, a sophisticated gathering of interesting people who treated him as an equal despite his humble background, combined with spiritual experiences that seemed to offer direct access to divine guidance. But as Marcus became more deeply involved in the organization, he had begun to notice the same disturbing undercurrents that had troubled other participants. Conversations would stop when he approached certain groups. People would disappear during ceremonies and return with expressions that mixed satisfaction with fear. Most troubling of all, he was increasingly pressured to use his position in the questor's office to provide information about government activities and to alter records in ways that would benefit other members of the organization. The pressure had intensified dramatically when Marcus had been selected for initiation into the inner mysteries. Pacula herself had approached him with what she described as a special honor, an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to Bacchus through participation in the most sacred aspects of Bacchanalian worship. She had made it clear that advancement within the organization depended on his willingness to embrace these deeper levels of spiritual dedication. Marcus had agreed to the initiation partly because he was curious about the inner workings of the organization, but mainly because he had begun to understand that refusal might have dangerous consequences. Too many people had simply disappeared from the regular ceremonies after declining invitations to participate in the inner mysteries. The official explanations for these disappearances always involved personal or professional obligations that had taken people away from Rome. But Marcus had begun to suspect that the reality was far more sinister. The ceremony that the surveillance team witnessed was Marcus's initiation into the sacred brotherhood, the inner circle that conducted the most extreme aspects of Bacchanalian worship. But instead of the spiritual elevation that he had been promised, Marcus found himself subjected to a systematic process of psychological and physical abuse designed to break down his resistance and transform him into a completely compliant tool of the organization. The initiation began in the main chamber of Claudia Tertia's villa, where Marcus was required to drink large quantities of wine that had been mixed with drugs that heightened his emotional responses while making it difficult for him to think clearly about what was happening to him. As his ability to resist psychological pressure diminished, he was subjected to increasingly intense forms of manipulation designed to make him believe that his survival depended on complete submission to the will of Bacchus, as interpreted by Pacula and her inner circle. The ceremony reached its climax when Marcus was taken to the underground chambers where the most extreme rituals were conducted. Here, surrounded by members of the sacred brotherhood who had already undergone similar initiations, he was required to participate in activities that violated every principle of Roman law and morality. The other participants made it clear that his willing involvement in these criminal acts would bind him permanently to the organization, making it impossible for him to expose their activities without destroying himself in the process. But Marcus's psychological conditioning had been incomplete, and even under the influence of drugs and alcohol, he retained enough awareness to understand what was being demanded of him. When he attempted to resist, the other participants responded with immediate violence, treating his reluctance as evidence of insufficient devotion to Bacchus that required correction through physical punishment. The surveillance team that witnessed these events faced an agonizing decision. Their orders were to observe and gather intelligence without taking action that might compromise the broader investigation. But they were also Romans with traditional values who found it difficult to stand by while a fellow citizen was tortured and possibly murdered. The decision was made to maintain their positions and continue gathering evidence, but several of the observers later reported that the experience had been among the most difficult of their military careers. Marcus Flavius survived that night, but barely. The combination of drugs, alcohol, physical abuse, and psychological trauma left him in a condition that would have required immediate medical attention under normal circumstances. Instead, he was taken to a private residence controlled by the organization, where he was held under guard while recovering from his ordeal. The official explanation for his absence from work was that he had contracted a serious illness that required extended rest and isolation. The intelligence that the surveillance team gathered about Marcus's treatment provided Consul Albinus with exactly the kind of concrete evidence he needed to justify taking action against the Bacchanalia. Here was a specific Roman citizen who had been kidnapped, drugged, tortured, and held against his will by an organization that included some of the most prominent members of Roman society. The criminal nature of these activities was undeniable, and their connection to the broader conspiracy was clearly established. But Albinus also understood that the case of Marcus Flavius was probably not unique. If the organization was willing to treat one relatively powerless Roman citizen in this manner, they had almost certainly subjected many others to similar abuse. The consul ordered his investigators to begin compiling a comprehensive list of Romans who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances after becoming involved with the Bacchanalia. This investigation revealed a pattern of violence and intimidation that extended far beyond what Publius Abucius had witnessed during his single encounter with the organization. Over the previous 3 years, at least 47 Roman citizens had died or disappeared under circumstances that could be connected to their involvement with Bacchanalian activities. The victims included not only participants who had tried to leave the organization, but also family members who had asked too many questions, and government officials who had shown interest in investigating reports of irregular religious practices. The most shocking cases involved entire families that had been eliminated when one member had threatened to expose the organization's activities. Lucius Quinctius Flamininus had been a young senator whose political career had been advancing rapidly until he had been recruited into the Bacchanalia by colleagues who assured him that participation would accelerate his rise to prominence. But Quinctius had been horrified by what he witnessed during the inner mysteries and had informed his wife and father about his intention to withdraw from the organization and possibly expose their criminal activities. Within a month, Quinctius, his wife, his 2 young children, and his elderly father had all died in what appeared to be a series of unrelated accidents. Quinctius himself had drowned while swimming in the Tiber, despite being known as an excellent swimmer. His wife had died from eating poisoned mushrooms that she had supposedly gathered herself, even though she was knowledgeable about edible plants and had never made such a mistake before. The children had perished in a house fire that had started under mysterious circumstances. The father had simply been found dead in his bed one morning, with no obvious cause of death. Individually, each of these deaths could have been explained as tragic but natural occurrences. Collectively, they formed a pattern that could only be interpreted as systematic elimination of a family that had become dangerous to the organization. The investigators found similar patterns involving at least 12 other families, suggesting that the Bacchanalia had been operating as a criminal enterprise that used murder as a routine tool for protecting its secrets. These discoveries transformed Albinus's understanding of what he was confronting. This wasn't simply a case of religious practices that had gotten out of hand, or even a conspiracy to commit various forms of fraud and extortion. The Bacchanalia represented a criminal organization that was systematically murdering Roman citizens who posed threats to its operations. The scale and sophistication of these activities suggested that the organization possessed resources and capabilities that rivaled those of the Roman state itself. The consul realized that conventional legal procedures would be inadequate for dealing with a conspiracy of this magnitude and ruthlessness. Normal trials would provide the defendants with opportunities to intimidate witnesses, bribe judges, and coordinate their defenses in ways that could undermine the entire prosecution. More importantly, the time required for individual trials would allow other members of the organization to eliminate evidence, flee the city, or take other actions to protect themselves and their associates. Albinus made the decision that would define his consulship and establish precedents that would influence Roman law for centuries to come. He would bypass normal legal procedures and invoke the emergency powers that the Senate could grant to consuls when the Republic faced existential threats. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum would give him the authority to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to preserve the state, including the power to arrest, try, and execute Roman citizens without the normal protections of Roman law. But first, Albinus needed to present his evidence to the Senate in a way that would convince his colleagues to grant him these extraordinary powers. This would require him to reveal information about the Bacchanalia that would shock senators who had no previous knowledge of the organization's activities. It would also require him to demonstrate that conventional legal remedies were inadequate for the threat that Rome faced. The consul spent several days preparing for what he knew would be one of the most important speeches of his career. He needed to present evidence that was detailed enough to convince skeptical senators that the threat was real, but not so graphic that it would be dismissed as impossible exaggeration. He also needed to address the inevitable concerns about the precedent that would be established by granting emergency powers to deal with what some senators might view as a domestic political issue rather than a genuine military threat. The speech that Albinus delivered to the Senate on the Ides of Quinctilis would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Roman Republic. Speaking before an assembly that included some of the most powerful and sophisticated political leaders in the ancient world, the consul revealed the existence of a conspiracy that had penetrated the highest levels of Roman society and threatened the fundamental principles upon which the Republic had been built. Albinus began his presentation by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the claims he was about to make. He understood that many senators would find it difficult to believe that such a comprehensive conspiracy could have operated for years without their knowledge. He also recognized that some of his colleagues might themselves be involved in the activities he was describing, making it necessary for him to present evidence that was so compelling that denial would be impossible. The consul's strategy was to begin with the most concrete and verifiable evidence, gradually building toward revelations that would have seemed incredible if they had been presented without proper preparation. He started by presenting testimony from Publius Abucius, whose account of his near initiation into the inner mysteries provided senators with a detailed description of the organization's methods and objectives. This testimony was corroborated by evidence gathered through surveillance, including detailed records of who had attended ceremonies and what activities had been observed. Albinus then presented evidence about the systematic elimination of Romans who had threatened to expose the organization's activities. He provided specific names, dates, and circumstances for dozens of suspicious deaths and disappearances, demonstrating patterns that could not be explained as coincidence. The consul was careful to focus on cases where the evidence was strongest and most verifiable, building a cumulative case that made the reality of systematic murder undeniable. The climax of Albinus's presentation came when he revealed the scope of the organization's membership and influence. Reading from lists that had been compiled through months of careful investigation, the consul identified hundreds of Romans who had been confirmed as participants in bacchanalian activities. The names included senators, magistrates, military commanders, and business leaders whose involvement demonstrated that the conspiracy had achieved a level of penetration that threatened the basic functioning of Roman government. The reaction of the Senate to these revelations was immediate and dramatic. Senators who had been skeptical about the need for emergency powers found themselves convinced that the Republic faced a threat unlike any in its history. Even those who might have been sympathetic to arguments about religious freedom and the rights of Roman citizens were forced to acknowledge that the activities Albinus described went far beyond legitimate religious practice into the realm of criminal conspiracy and treason. The debate that followed Albinus's presentation was brief but intense. Several senators attempted to argue that the evidence, while disturbing, did not justify the extreme measures that the consul was requesting. They pointed out that Roman law provided procedures for dealing with criminal conspiracies, and that these procedures included protections for the rights of citizens that would be violated by the emergency powers Albinus sought. But these arguments were overwhelmed by the testimony of senators who had personal knowledge of some of the suspicious deaths and disappearances that Albinus had described. Marcus Porcius Cato, whose reputation for integrity was unquestioned, stood to confirm that he had personally investigated several of the cases the consul had mentioned and had reached similar conclusions about their suspicious nature. Other senators provided additional corroboration, describing their own experiences with Romans who had become involved with the Bacchanalia and had subsequently died or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The final vote was overwhelming. The Senate granted Consul Albinus the emergency powers he had requested, authorizing him to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to eliminate the threat posed by the Bacchanalia. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum was passed by a margin that demonstrated the depth of senatorial concern about the conspiracy and the level of trust that Albinus enjoyed among his colleagues. But the consul understood that the hard work was only beginning. The Senate had given him the authority to act, but the success of his campaign against the Bacchanalia would depend on his ability to execute a complex operation that would need to neutralize hundreds of conspirators simultaneously while protecting innocent Romans who might have been coerced into participation. The organization had demonstrated its willingness to use violence to protect its secrets, and Albinus knew that his actions would likely provoke desperate attempts at retaliation. The planning for what would become known as the Night of Reckoning began immediately after the Senate vote. Albinus and his inner circle worked through the night to develop operational plans that would allow them to arrest the key leaders of the Bacchanalia while gathering evidence that could be used in subsequent prosecutions. They also needed to coordinate with military commanders throughout Italy to prevent conspirators from fleeing to other regions where they might attempt to reconstitute their organization. The first priority was securing the testimony and cooperation of Romans who possessed detailed knowledge of the organization's structure and activities, but who might be willing to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for leniency. Publius Ebutius had already demonstrated his willingness to testify, but the consul needed additional witnesses who could provide information about different aspects of the conspiracy. The breakthrough came when investigators approached Gaius Volumnius, the military tribune who had recruited Marcus Flavius and dozens of other Romans into the organization. Volumnius had initially been defiant when confronted with evidence of his involvement, claiming that his activities were protected by religious freedom and that the charges against him were politically motivated. But when presented with detailed evidence of the murders that had been committed to protect the organization's secrets, he had undergone a complete psychological collapse. Volumnius revealed that he had never intended to become involved in criminal activities when he had first joined the Bacchanalia. Like many participants, he had been attracted by the promise of networking opportunities and spiritual experiences that were unavailable through conventional channels. But the organization's system of gradual compromise had trapped him in a web of complicity that made withdrawal impossible without risking his life and the lives of his family members. The Tribune's testimony provided investigators with detailed information about the organization's command structure, recruitment methods, and operational procedures. He identified the members of Paculla's inner circle and explained how decisions were made about which participants would be selected for the inner mysteries. Most importantly, he provided specific information about planned ceremonies and meetings that could be used to coordinate arrests and gather additional evidence. Similar breakthroughs were achieved with other participants who had been trapped in the organization against their better judgment. Marcus Plautius, the young aristocrat who had been among the first men initiated under Paculla's new system, agreed to cooperate after being shown evidence that his continued involvement would inevitably lead to his participation in murder. Lucius Opimius, despite his deeper involvement in the inner mysteries, provided crucial intelligence about the organization's financial resources and the locations where evidence might be hidden. These defections created a cascade effect as other participants realized that the organization's protection was illusory and that cooperation with the investigation offered their only hope of avoiding execution. Within a week, Albinus had assembled a comprehensive picture of the Bacchanalia's structure, membership, and activities that would allow him to plan surgical strikes against the most dangerous elements while offering opportunities for redemption to those who had been coerced into participation. The night of reckoning began at sunset on the 20th day of Quinctilis, when teams of soldiers and officials fanned out across Rome and the surrounding countryside to execute simultaneously coordinated arrests of the Bacchanalia's leadership. The operation had been planned with military precision to prevent conspirators from warning each other or destroying evidence that would be needed for subsequent prosecutions. Pacula Ania herself was arrested at her private villa, where she was found conducting a ceremony for a small group of her most trusted associates. The high priestess had been so confident in her organization's invulnerability that she made no attempt to resist arrest or destroy the extensive records that documented years of criminal activities. Her capture yielded a treasure trove of information about the organization's finances, membership, and planned operations that would prove invaluable for the broader investigation. Claudia Tertia was taken into custody at her estate, along with several members of the Sacred Brotherhood who had been participating in one of the inner mysteries. The underground chambers where the most extreme rituals were conducted yielded physical evidence of torture and murder that corroborated the testimony of witnesses and demonstrated the criminal nature of the organization's activities beyond any reasonable doubt. Throughout the night, similar arrests were carried out at locations across the region. By dawn, over 300 Romans had been taken into custody, including some of the most prominent citizens in the Republic. The scale of the operation sent shockwaves through Roman society, as families awakened to discover that relatives and friends had been arrested in connection with activities that few Romans had previously known existed. The immediate aftermath of the arrests was chaotic, as rumors spread throughout the city about the nature of the charges and the identity of those who had been detained. Some Romans initially assumed that the operation was politically motivated, an attempt by Consul Albinus to eliminate his rivals through false accusations of religious crimes. But as evidence of the organization's activities became public, initial skepticism gave way to horror and outrage at the scope of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. The trials that followed would establish precedents for how the Roman legal system dealt with complex criminal conspiracies involving large numbers of defendants. Albinus made the decision to conduct public proceedings that would allow ordinary Romans to understand the full extent of the threat that had been eliminated. The evidence was presented in detail, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and physical exhibits that demonstrated the criminal nature of the activities beyond any reasonable doubt. The verdicts, when they came, reflected both the severity of the crimes and the different levels of culpability among the various defendants. Pacula Ania and the core members of her inner circle were sentenced to death. Their executions carried out publicly to demonstrate that no Roman, regardless of social position, was above the law. Lesser participants who could demonstrate that they had been coerced into involvement were given opportunities to redeem themselves through exile, military service, or other forms of public penance. The broader impact of the Bacchanalia trials extended far beyond the immediate punishment of the conspirators. The revelations about the organization's activities sparked a broader examination of Roman religious practices and the influence of foreign cults on traditional Roman values. New laws were passed regulating religious activities and establishing procedures for investigating allegations of criminal conduct disguised as religious observance. Most importantly, the trials established the principle that religious freedom, while important, could not be used as a shield for criminal activities that threatened the security and stability of the Roman state. This precedent would influence Roman law for centuries, providing legal frameworks for dealing with religious movements that challenged state authority while protecting the rights of Romans to practice legitimate forms of worship. But even as Rome celebrated the elimination of the Bacchanalia threat, thoughtful observers understood that the conspiracy had revealed deeper problems within Roman society that could not be solved simply through arrests and trials. The ease with which the organization had recruited hundreds of Romans, including many from prominent families, suggested that traditional Roman values were under pressure from forces that went beyond any single criminal conspiracy. The wealth and luxury that had flowed into Rome from its conquests had created new temptations and new opportunities for corruption that challenged the austere virtues upon which the Republic had been built. Greek cultural influences had introduced philosophical and religious ideas that questioned traditional Roman assumptions about duty, morality, and the proper relationship between individual desires and collective responsibilities. Most troubling of all, the Bacchanalia had demonstrated how quickly religious devotion could be transformed into criminal conspiracy when guided by individuals who understood how to exploit human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence. The psychological mechanisms that had made the organization so effective at recruiting and controlling its members were not unique to this particular conspiracy. They represented vulnerabilities within human nature that could be exploited by future movements that combined spiritual authority with criminal objectives. These deeper concerns would continue to influence Roman political and cultural development long after the immediate threat of the Bacchanalia had been eliminated. The trials had saved the Republic from one particular conspiracy, but they had also revealed the fragility of the social bonds that held Roman civilization together. The challenge for future generations would be finding ways to preserve the flexibility and openness that had made Rome great while protecting against the corrupting influences that threatened to destroy the values that had created that greatness in the first place. The story of the Bacchanalia would be remembered not just as an account of criminal conspiracy and its punishment, but as a warning about the eternal struggle between the forces that build civilizations and those that seek to corrupt them from within. It was a story that would resonate through the ages, reminding future generations that the price of freedom and prosperity is constant vigilance against those who would exploit human weaknesses for their own destructive purposes. The legacy of the Bacchanalia scandal extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the trials and executions. In the months and years that followed the Night of Reckoning, Rome found itself grappling with questions that would define the character of the Republic for generations to come. How could such a vast conspiracy have operated undetected for so long? What did the ease of recruitment reveal about the spiritual and moral condition of Roman society? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other such organizations might still be operating in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike at the heart of Roman civilization? These questions haunted Consul Albinus long after his term of office had ended. In private conversations with close friends, he would often reflect on the deeper implications of what he had uncovered. The Bacchanalia had not emerged from nowhere. They had grown out of real human needs that traditional Roman society was failing to address. Young Romans like Publius Ebutius and Marcus Flavius had been vulnerable to recruitment, not because they were inherently corrupt, but because they were seeking meaning, community, and opportunities for advancement that the rigid hierarchies of Roman society made difficult to obtain through legitimate channels. This realization led Albinus to become an advocate for reforms that would address the underlying social conditions that had made the Bacchanalia possible. He argued that Rome needed to find ways to channel the energy and ambition of its young people into constructive activities that served the broader interests of the Republic. He also believed that traditional Roman religion needed to be revitalized to provide the kind of spiritual experiences that Romans were seeking in foreign cults and mystery religions. But Albinus was not naive about the challenges involved in implementing such reforms. The very success of Roman conquests had created wealth and opportunities that made it difficult to maintain the austere virtues that had built the Republic. Greek slaves and freedmen continued to arrive in Rome, bringing with them philosophical and religious ideas that challenged traditional Roman assumptions about proper behavior and social organization. Most importantly, the economic interests that had grown up around Rome's expanding empire created powerful constituencies that resisted any changes that might threaten their profits. The tension between these competing forces played out dramatically in the career of Marcus Porcius Cato, who emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for returning to traditional Roman values in the wake of the Bacchanalia revelations. Cato had supported Albinus during the crisis, providing crucial testimony about suspicious deaths and disappearances that had helped convince the Senate to grant emergency powers. But in the years that followed, he became increasingly concerned that the elimination of one conspiracy had not addressed the broader cultural decay that had made such conspiracies possible. Cato's response was to launch a comprehensive campaign against what he saw as the corrupting influences of Greek culture and foreign luxury. As censor in 184 BCE, he used his authority to impose heavy taxes on expensive imported goods and to remove senators whose behavior he deemed inconsistent with traditional Roman virtue. He also supported legislation that restricted the activities of foreign priests and philosophers, arguing that their teachings undermined the moral foundations upon which Roman greatness had been built. These efforts produced mixed results. Cato succeeded in creating a political movement that celebrated traditional Roman values and viewed foreign influences with suspicion. His speeches and writings provided later generations with powerful articulations of what it meant to be Roman, emphasizing duty, discipline, and devotion to the collective good over individual pleasure and advancement. But his reforms also created a backlash among Romans who had been exposed to Greek philosophy and culture, and who found traditional Roman approaches to life and learning inadequate for the complexities of governing a Mediterranean empire. The conflict between these perspectives became particularly intense in the realm of education and intellectual development. Traditional Roman education had focused on practical skills needed for military service and civic participation, with little emphasis on abstract philosophical speculation or artistic achievement. But exposure to Greek culture had introduced Romans to forms of learning and expression that seemed to offer richer and more sophisticated approaches to understanding the world and humanity's place within it. Young Romans like Gaius Laelius found themselves caught between these competing visions of what Roman civilization should become. Laelius came from a family that had served the Republic with distinction for generations, but he had also been exposed to Greek philosophy and literature through his friendship with the historian Polybius and other Greek intellectuals who had been brought to Rome as hostages. This exposure had given him perspectives on ethics, politics, and human nature that went far beyond anything available through traditional Roman sources. The challenge for Laelius and others like him was finding ways to integrate these new forms of knowledge with their inherited commitments to Roman values and institutions. They understood that blind rejection of foreign influences would impoverish Roman culture and limit its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But they also recognized that uncritical acceptance of foreign ideas could undermine the distinctive characteristics that had made Rome successful in the first place. This dilemma became particularly acute when it came to questions of religion and spirituality. The Bacchanalia had demonstrated the dangers of foreign mystery religions that operated outside the traditional structures of Roman religious authority. But they had also revealed the limitations of conventional Roman religious practices, which seemed unable to provide the kind of intense spiritual experiences that many Romans were seeking. The solution that gradually emerged was a form of religious syncretism that incorporated selected elements of Greek and other foreign traditions within frameworks that remained recognizably Roman. New temples were built to honor gods and goddesses who combined Roman and foreign characteristics. Religious festivals were expanded to include ceremonies that drew on Greek models while maintaining their essential Roman character. Most importantly, the priesthoods that oversaw these developments were staffed by Romans who understood both the appeal of foreign religious practices and the importance of maintaining continuity with traditional Roman values. This process of adaptation and integration was not without its controversies and setbacks. Conservative Romans continued to view any foreign influence with suspicion, arguing that the Bacchanalia had demonstrated the inevitable consequences of abandoning traditional practices. Progressive Romans, on the other hand, sometimes pushed for changes that seemed to threaten the fundamental character of Roman civilization. The ongoing tension between these perspectives created a dynamic that would influence Roman cultural development for centuries. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the Bacchanalia affair was the establishment of new legal and administrative procedures for investigating and prosecuting complex criminal conspiracies. The emergency powers that had been granted to Consul Albinus created precedents that would be invoked by future Roman leaders facing similar threats. But these precedents also raised troubling questions about the balance between security and freedom in republican government. The trials that had followed the Night of Reckoning had been conducted with scrupulous attention to evidence and due process, but they had also demonstrated how easily emergency powers could be used to eliminate political opponents or suppress unpopular movements. Future Roman leaders would face the temptation to invoke the precedent of the Bacchanalia to justify actions that served their personal interests rather than the broader good of the Republic. This tension became particularly evident during the career of Gaius Gracchus, who used arguments similar to those employed by Albinus to justify his controversial land reform proposals. Gracchus argued that the concentration of wealth and land ownership in the hands of a few powerful families posed a threat to the Republic that was comparable to the conspiracy that the Bacchanalia had represented. He claimed that emergency measures were necessary to address this threat before it could destroy the social foundations upon which Roman greatness depended. But Gracchus's opponents argued that he was using the precedent of the Bacchanalia to justify actions that were themselves threats to republican government. They pointed out that the original emergency powers had been granted to deal with a clear criminal conspiracy involving murder and other violent crimes, while Gracchus was seeking to use similar powers to address economic and social problems that could be resolved through normal legislative procedures. The debate over these issues revealed how the Bacchanalia affair had changed Roman political culture in fundamental ways. The revelation that hundreds of prominent Romans had participated in a criminal conspiracy had shaken confidence in the traditional assumptions about civic virtue and public service that had guided republican government. Romans could no longer assume that their leaders were motivated primarily by devotion to the common good, since so many apparently virtuous citizens had been revealed as participants in activities that served only their own corrupt desires. This erosion of trust had profound implications for the functioning of republican institutions. The Roman system of government had always depended on informal networks of personal relationships, mutual obligations, and shared commitments to republican values. When these relationships were compromised by suspicion and mistrust, the entire system became less effective at addressing the challenges facing Roman society. The problem was compounded by the fact that the Bacchanalia investigations had revealed the extent to which criminal organizations could penetrate and manipulate legitimate institutions. The conspiracy had included senators, magistrates, military commanders, and other officials whose positions gave them the authority to make decisions that affected the entire republic. This demonstrated that corruption could not be addressed simply through better laws or more vigorous enforcement, since the people responsible for implementing these measures might themselves be compromised. These concerns led to ongoing efforts to reform Roman institutions in ways that would make them more resistant to corruption and manipulation. New procedures were established for investigating allegations of official misconduct. Additional oversight mechanisms were created to monitor the activities of magistrates and other officials. Most importantly, greater emphasis was placed on the moral education of young Romans, who would eventually assume positions of public responsibility. But these institutional reforms could only address part of the problem revealed by the Bacchanalia affair. The deeper challenge was cultural and spiritual, involving questions about what it meant to be Roman and what values should guide individual and collective behavior in an increasingly complex and cosmopolitan society. Traditional Roman culture had been built around the assumption that individual desires should be subordinated to collective needs, that personal advancement should serve broader public purposes, and that immediate pleasures should be sacrificed for long-term benefits to family and community. These values had worked well when Rome was a small city-state surrounded by enemies and struggling for survival. But they seemed less relevant in an empire where wealth and luxury were readily available and where traditional sources of meaning and purpose had been disrupted by rapid social change. The Bacchanalia had offered an alternative vision of human fulfillment that emphasized individual experience, personal transcendence, and liberation from conventional moral constraints. This vision had proved attractive to Romans, who felt constrained by traditional expectations and who were seeking forms of meaning and community that went beyond what conventional Roman society could provide. The challenge for Roman leaders was finding ways to address these legitimate human needs without opening the door to the kind of corruption and criminality that the Bacchanalia had represented. This required developing new approaches to education, religion, and social organization that could provide Romans with rich and meaningful lives while maintaining their commitment to the values and institutions that had made Roman greatness possible. One of the most promising developments in this regard was the emergence of philosophical schools that combined Greek intellectual sophistication with Roman practical wisdom. These schools offered young Romans access to forms of learning and reflection that went far beyond traditional Roman education, while emphasizing ethical principles that were compatible with republican values. The academy that was established by Carneades and other Greek philosophers provided Roman students with rigorous training in logic, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. But unlike the Bacchanalia, these schools operated openly, welcomed scrutiny from Roman authorities, and emphasized the importance of civic responsibility and public service. Students were encouraged to think critically about fundamental questions of ethics and politics, but within frameworks that reinforced rather than undermined their obligations as Roman citizens. Similar developments occurred in the realm of religion, where new forms of worship emerged that combined the emotional intensity that Romans were seeking with respect for traditional Roman religious authority. The cult of Magna Mater, for example, incorporated elements of ecstatic worship that had characterized the Bacchanalia, but within structures that were carefully regulated by Roman priests and magistrates. These new religious practices provided Romans with opportunities for transcendent spiritual experiences while maintaining clear boundaries that prevented the kind of criminal exploitation that had characterized the Bacchanalia. Participants could experience emotional and spiritual liberation without being required to violate fundamental moral principles or commit criminal acts as proof of their devotion. The gradual success of these alternative approaches demonstrated that the problems revealed by the Bacchanalia could be addressed through constructive reforms rather than simply through repression and punishment. Romans did not need to choose between spiritual fulfillment and civic virtue, between individual development and collective responsibility. What they needed were institutions and practices that could integrate these different aspects of human experience in ways that served both personal and public good. But this process of cultural adaptation and reform was neither quick nor easy. It required ongoing effort by multiple generations of Roman leaders who understood both the importance of preserving traditional values and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances. It also required the active participation of ordinary Romans who were willing to experiment with new approaches while maintaining their fundamental commitments to the Republic and its ideals. The legacy of the Bacchanalia continued to influence these efforts long after the immediate crisis had passed. The memory of how easily hundreds of Romans had been seduced into criminal conspiracy served as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to maintain republican government and civic virtue. But the successful resolution of the crisis also demonstrated that Romans possessed the wisdom and determination necessary to address even the most serious threats to their civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Bacchanalia affair established principles and precedents that would guide Roman responses to similar challenges in the future. The investigation and trials had shown that no Roman, regardless of social position or political influence, was above the law. They had also demonstrated that religious freedom, while important, could not be used as a shield for criminal activities that threatened the security and stability of the state. These principles would be tested repeatedly as Rome continued to expand and encounter new forms of cultural and religious diversity. Each new challenge would require Romans to balance competing values and interests while maintaining their essential commitment to republican government and civic virtue. The precedents established during the Bacchanalia crisis would provide guidance for these future decisions, helping Romans distinguish between legitimate expressions of religious and cultural diversity and dangerous threats to the foundations of their civilization. The story of the Bacchanalia thus represents more than simply an account of criminal conspiracy and its punishment. It illustrates the ongoing challenge that all successful civilizations face in maintaining their essential character while adapting to changing circumstances. It demonstrates both the dangers of uncritical acceptance of foreign influences and the limitations of rigid adherence to traditional practices that may no longer be adequate for contemporary challenges. Most importantly, it shows how individual choices and actions can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate effects. The decisions made by Pecula Annia to transform innocent religious ceremonies into criminal enterprises ultimately affected thousands of Romans and influenced the development of Roman law and culture for centuries. Similarly, the courage shown by Publius Aebutius in resisting corruption and exposing criminal activity helped preserve the Republic and protect future generations from similar threats. The Bacchanalia affair reminds us that the preservation of civilized society requires constant vigilance and the willingness of individuals to take personal risks in defense of collective values. It also demonstrates that even the most serious threats can be overcome when people of goodwill work together to address challenges that no individual could handle alone. As we reach the end of this first part of our exploration into the Bacchanalia, we've witnessed how religious devotion can be corrupted into criminal conspiracy, how individual vulnerability can be exploited for destructive purposes, and how the courage of a few individuals can protect an entire civilization from those who would destroy it from within. But our story is far from over. In the next episode, we'll delve deeper into the actual trials that followed the Night of Reckoning, examining how Roman legal procedures were adapted to handle a conspiracy of unprecedented scope and complexity. We'll meet the defendants who faced judgment for their participation in the Bacchanalia, from Pecula Annia herself to the ordinary Romans who had been trapped by her web of corruption and coercion. We'll also explore the broader consequences of the trials for Roman society, including the new laws and institutions that were created to prevent similar conspiracies from emerging in the future. And we'll examine how the memory of the Bacchanalia continued to influence Roman political and cultural development, shaping attitudes toward religion, foreign influences, and the proper balance between individual freedom and collective security. The Bacchanalia represents one of the most dramatic confrontations between religious liberty and state authority in ancient history, but it also reveals timeless truths about human nature, the corruption of power, and the eternal struggle between those who would build civilizations and those who would destroy them for their own benefit. The trials that followed would reveal depths of corruption that even Consul Albinus had not anticipated. As dawn broke over Rome on the day after the Night of Reckoning, the city found itself transformed. Hundreds of families woke to discover that fathers, sons, mothers, and daughters had vanished in the darkness. The forum buzzed with whispered conversations as Romans struggled to understand what had happened and what it meant for their own safety. But perhaps no one was more shocked than Gaius Scribonius Curio, a respected senator whose own son had been among those arrested. Curio had built his political career on a reputation for unwavering moral integrity. He had served Rome faithfully in multiple campaigns, governed provinces with distinction, and accumulated wealth through honest business dealings, rather than the corruption that had begun to characterize so many of his contemporaries. When the soldiers had arrived at his villa in the early hours of the morning, Curio had initially assumed there had been some terrible mistake. His son Marcus was barely 22 years old, a young man who had shown every sign of following in his father's footsteps as a devoted servant of the Republic. Marcus had never displayed interest in Greek philosophy or foreign religious practices. He had never associated with the kind of dissolute young Romans who were known for their excessive drinking and sexual adventures. But as Curio listened to the charges being read against his son, he began to understand that his knowledge of Marcus's activities had been woefully incomplete. The young man had apparently been attending bacchanalian ceremonies for over 6 months, recruited by friends whose own participation Curio had never suspected. More shocking still, Marcus had allegedly participated in the inner mysteries, making him complicit in activities that violated every principle his father had tried to instill in him. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had identified him as a regular participant in ceremonies at various locations throughout the city. Physical evidence placed him at the underground chambers beneath Claudia Terfia's villa on nights when murders had been committed. Most damning of all, other participants who were cooperating with the investigation had provided detailed testimony about Marcus's enthusiastic involvement in the most extreme aspects of bacchanalian worship. Curio's initial reaction was complete denial. He insisted that the witnesses were lying, that the evidence had been fabricated, that his son was being framed by political enemies who wanted to destroy his family's reputation. But as more details emerged, denial became impossible. Too many people had seen Marcus at the ceremonies. Too many independent sources corroborated the same basic facts. Most devastating of all, Marcus himself eventually confessed, breaking down completely when confronted with evidence of his participation in activities that had resulted in the deaths of innocent Romans. The psychological destruction of a father watching his son revealed as a criminal was something that Curio would never recover from. But his personal anguish was multiplied throughout Roman society as family after family discovered that people they had trusted and loved had been living secret lives that violated everything they claimed to believe in. Titus Manlius Torquatus faced a similar revelation about his younger brother, Aulus, who had been arrested while participating in one of the inner mysteries. Torquatus had served as a military commander in Spain and had returned to Rome with a reputation for the kind of stern discipline that had built the Republic's military success. He had assumed that his brother shared his commitment to traditional Roman values and had been grooming him for a political career that would honor their family's legacy. The discovery that Aulus had been systematically violating every moral principle that the Manlius family had upheld for generations created a crisis that went beyond personal disappointment into the realm of existential horror. Torquatus had built his identity around the assumption that Roman virtue was something that could be transmitted from father to son, from brother to brother, through example and education. The revelation that his own brother had rejected these values so completely called into question everything that Torquatus believed about human nature and moral development. But Aulus's case also illustrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had made the Bacchanalia so effective at recruiting and controlling their members. When investigators interviewed him, they discovered that his involvement had begun innocently enough. He had been approached by friends who described the ceremonies as networking opportunities where young Romans could meet influential people who might advance their careers. The initial ceremonies that Aulus attended had indeed been relatively innocent social gatherings, where wine flowed freely and conversations ranged over topics that were rarely discussed in more formal Roman social settings. The participants included some genuinely impressive Romans whose success in business and politics made them attractive role models for ambitious young men. The atmosphere was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, offering exposure to ideas and experiences that seemed to represent the future direction of Roman civilization. But the organization's system of gradual compromise had worked exactly as Paculla had designed it. Each subsequent ceremony had pushed boundaries a little further, introduced elements that were a little more transgressive, created situations that were a little more difficult to explain to outsiders. By the time Aulus understood what he had really joined, he was already so compromised that withdrawal seemed impossible without destroying himself and his family. The inner mysteries that Aulus had eventually joined represented the culmination of this process of systematic corruption. Participants were required to engage in activities that violated every taboo of Roman civilization, often involving violence against innocent victims who were presented as sacrificial offerings to Bacchus. The religious framework provided justification for these acts, transforming criminal behavior into sacred duty that participants felt honored to perform. But the psychological mechanisms that made this transformation possible were fragile and dependent on maintaining the closed environment where normal moral standards could be suspended. When Aulus was removed from this environment and forced to confront his actions according to conventional Roman legal and moral standards, the entire psychological structure collapsed. He experienced what modern observers might recognize as a complete mental breakdown, alternating between periods of catatonic withdrawal and episodes of violent self-recrimination. The interviews with Aulus and other participants provided investigators with crucial insights into how the organization had operated and how it had maintained control over its members. They learned that the Bacchanalia had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying potential recruits who possessed the right combination of ambition, vulnerability, and moral flexibility. They had also created elaborate systems for monitoring participants and ensuring that anyone who showed signs of wavering commitment was either brought back into line or eliminated as a threat. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the interviews revealed that many participants had genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose, that their violations of conventional morality were actually expressions of divine will that would ultimately benefit Roman society. The religious framework had been so complete and so psychologically compelling that intelligent, educated Romans had lost the ability to evaluate their actions according to normal ethical standards. This discovery forced Roman authorities to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of religious belief and its relationship to moral behavior. Traditional Roman religion had always emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the gods through ritual observance and moral conduct. But the Bacchanalia had demonstrated how religious authority could be manipulated to justify behaviors that violated the most fundamental principles of civilized society. The trials that began in the weeks following the arrests would need to address not only the specific criminal acts that participants had committed, but also the broader question of how Roman law should deal with crimes that had been committed under the influence of what defendants claimed was genuine religious conviction. This challenge would push Roman legal thinking in new directions and establish precedents that would influence the development of law for centuries. Consul Albinus understood that the trials would be watched not only by Romans, but by people throughout the Mediterranean world who were curious about how the Republic would handle such an unprecedented challenge. The proceedings would need to demonstrate Roman justice while also serving as a deterrent to future conspiracies. They would need to punish the guilty while protecting the innocent, to uphold the rule of law while respecting legitimate religious practices. The first major decision that Albinus faced was how to organize the trials themselves. The sheer number of defendants made it impossible to conduct individual proceedings for each participant. But mass trials risked violating the due process protections that were fundamental to Roman legal tradition. The solution was to create different categories of defendants based on their level of involvement and culpability, with separate proceedings for each category. The first category consisted of the core leadership of the organization, including Paculla Annia herself and the members of her inner circle who had planned and directed the most serious criminal activities. These individuals would face the most serious charges and would be tried with full legal protections. to ensure that their convictions could not be challenged on procedural grounds. The second category included participants who had been involved in the inner mysteries and had participated directly in violent crimes. While these individuals were clearly guilty of serious offences, their trials would include consideration of the psychological manipulation and coercion that had influenced their behaviour. Some might be eligible for reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. The third category consisted of participants who had attended regular ceremonies but had not been involved in the most extreme activities. Many of these individuals appeared to be victims rather than willing criminals, people who had been gradually manipulated into compromising positions without fully understanding what they were becoming involved in. Their cases would be handled through special procedures designed to distinguish between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved an opportunity for redemption. The trial of Pakula Anya herself became the centerpiece of the entire proceeding, both because of her central role in creating and directing the conspiracy, and because her case would establish important precedents for how Roman law dealt with crimes committed under the cover of religious authority. The charges against her were comprehensive, including murder, conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and violations of numerous laws governing religious practices. The evidence presented against Pakula was overwhelming and came from multiple independent sources. Former participants provided detailed testimony about her role in planning and directing criminal activities. Physical evidence from the locations where ceremonies had been conducted corroborated their accounts. Financial records demonstrated how she had enriched herself through the systematic exploitation of her followers. But Pakula's defense strategy was as sophisticated as the organization she had created. Her lawyers argued that she was a legitimate religious leader whose practices were protected by Roman law and tradition. They claimed that the charges against her were based on misunderstandings of ancient religious ceremonies that had been practiced for centuries without official interference. They also suggested that the prosecution was politically motivated, an attempt by conservative Romans to suppress religious practices that challenged traditional assumptions about morality and social organization. This defense forced prosecutors to demonstrate not only that specific crimes had been committed, but also that these crimes were not protected forms of religious expression. They needed to show that the activities conducted under the banner of Bacchanalian worship had crossed the line from legitimate religious practice into criminal conspiracy. The key to the prosecution's case was establishing the systematic nature of the criminal activities and their complete disconnection from any authentic religious purpose. Witnesses testified about how traditional Bacchanalian ceremonies had been gradually transformed into something entirely different, how religious authority had been used to coerce participants into criminal behavior, and how the organization had used violence to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The testimony of Publius Abutius was particularly crucial, both because he had witnessed the organization's recruitment and indoctrination methods firsthand, and because his resistance to participation demonstrated that cooperation had not been inevitable. His account of the psychological pressure that had been applied to force his participation showed how the organization had operated as a criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate religious movement. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from the organization's own records, which Pakula had maintained with meticulous attention to detail. These documents revealed the systematic planning that had gone into recruiting specific individuals, the careful tracking of compromising information that could be used for blackmail, and the cold calculation with which decisions had been made about eliminating threats to the organization's security. The records also revealed the extent to which the organization had infiltrated legitimate Roman institutions. Lists of participants included senators, magistrates, military commanders, and other officials whose positions had given them the ability to protect the conspiracy from official investigation. Financial records showed how the organization had used its resources to influence political decisions, business transactions, and legal proceedings throughout Roman society. This evidence demonstrated that the Bacchanalia had operated as a shadow government that pursued its own interests rather than serving the broader Roman community. The religious framework had been merely a disguise for activities that threatened the fundamental principles upon which the Republic was built. The verdict in Peculla's case was never in doubt, but the sentence reflected both the severity of her crimes and the precedent that her case would establish for future prosecutions. She was condemned to death, but the method of execution was chosen to emphasize the religious dimensions of her crimes. Instead of the traditional forms of execution used for ordinary criminals, Peculla was sentenced to be burned alive, a punishment that symbolically purified the community from the religious pollution that her activities had created. The execution was conducted publicly in the Forum, with thousands of Romans witnessing the final destruction of the woman who had corrupted so many of their fellow citizens. But the ceremony was carefully orchestrated to emphasize justice rather than vengeance, with traditional religious rituals performed to restore the proper relationship between Rome and the gods that Peculla's activities had violated. The trials of other core leaders followed similar patterns, with evidence of systematic criminal activity leading to convictions and severe sentences. But these proceedings also revealed the complex relationships and competing loyalties that had made the organization so effective at maintaining secrecy and controlling its members. Marcus Atinius Labeo had been one of Peculla's most trusted lieutenants, responsible for managing the organization's finances and coordinating its activities across multiple locations. But his trial revealed that his involvement had been motivated as much by fear as by greed or religious conviction. Labeo had joined the organization voluntarily, attracted by promises of wealth and influence, but he had remained involved primarily because he understood that withdrawal would result in his death and the destruction of his family. The testimony in Labeo's case provided crucial insights into how the organization had maintained discipline and prevented defections. Participants were bound to the group not only by shared guilt and mutual vulnerability, but also by genuine terror of the consequences that would follow any attempt to break free. The organization had demonstrated repeatedly that it possessed both the will and the capability to eliminate threats, and this knowledge had kept even reluctant participants in line. But Labeo's case also illustrated the possibility of redemption for people who had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. When offered the opportunity to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence, he had provided crucial information that had helped authorities understand the full scope of the conspiracy and identify other participants who might not have been discovered otherwise. The cooperation that Labeo and others provided created a cascade effect that ultimately led to the identification of hundreds of Romans who had been involved in bacchanalian activities to some degree. But this information also created new challenges for the legal system, as authorities struggled to distinguish between willing criminals and reluctant victims, between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved assistance in rebuilding their lives. The case of Gaius Servilius Vatia illustrated these complications perfectly. Vatia was a young senator from a distinguished family who had been recruited into the Bacchanalia during his first year in office. The organization had targeted him specifically because of his political potential and his access to sensitive government information that could be valuable for their operations. The evidence showed that Vatia had attended numerous ceremonies and had participated in activities that clearly violated Roman law. But it also revealed that his participation had been coerced through a combination of blackmail, threats, and psychological manipulation that had left him with little choice but to cooperate. The organization had systematically compromised him through a series of increasingly serious transgressions, each one making it more difficult for him to withdraw without facing complete destruction. Vatia's trial became a test case for how Roman law would deal with defendants who were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, people who had committed serious crimes but had done so under duress that called into question their moral culpability. The prosecutors argued that coercion could not excuse participation in murder and other violent crimes, that Vatia had possessed alternatives to cooperation that he had chosen not to pursue. But the defense presented evidence about the sophisticated psychological techniques that the organization had used to break down resistance and create the illusion that cooperation was the only viable option. They argued that Vartiya had been systematically brainwashed through a process that was comparable to military indoctrination, and that his actions should be evaluated according to standards that took this manipulation into account. The verdict in Vartiya's case established important precedents for how Roman law would treat crimes committed under coercion. He was found guilty of the charges against him, but his sentence was reduced to reflect the extenuating circumstances of his participation. Instead of execution or permanent exile, he was sentenced to military service in a distant province, where he would have the opportunity to redeem himself through service to the Republic. This approach became the model for handling many of the cases involving participants who could demonstrate that their involvement had been coerced rather than voluntary. The trials established the principle that coercion could mitigate but not eliminate criminal responsibility, and that defendants who had been manipulated into criminal behavior could earn redemption through subsequent service to the community they had harmed. And there we have it. From Pakula Anya's first whispered promises in moonlit groves to the final trials that would reshape Roman law forever, we've witnessed how easily the sacred can become profane, how quickly devotion transforms into exploitation, and how the courage of one young man named Publius Abutius saved an entire civilization from corruption that had infected its very soul. The Bacchanalia reminds us that freedom's greatest enemy isn't the obvious tyrant, but the seducer who promises liberation while forging chains.